Okay, just let us know when. Yeah.
Oh,
Well, we can't even. It
it's up,
Okay.
so I will take you off.
Okay.
It
actually
needs to be.
the webinar that was having the problem. So I'm joining as a co-host, but I don't have any of the streaming buttons, except it seems to now be working. So that we were having the problem with one of them, and now on others it doesn't seem to have a problem.
Yeah, seems like we're okay.
So it's streaming right now. Are we live or are we still in practice mode? Because it's not telling me.
It says
So maybe it was just
recording.
some weird glitch
Maybe
with
we're
that one
live.
specific one.
I think we're live.
Yep, I see people
I think you're live.
chiming in at the bottom.
Okay. Yeah. Looks like we've got
we
we've
have
got
a
people
question.
saying. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started then. So this is the world building panel. I am Daniel Dvorkin, your moderator.
Okay,
And,
thanks.
I think we'll just go ahead and have all the panelists introduce themselves here. Matthew, do you want to go ahead and start?
You want me to go first? Excellent. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Matt Rotundo. I am a writer. I'm from Omaha, Nebraska. I've got a couple of, I write science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I have a couple of science fiction novels out right now. First two in a series. The first book is called Petra, and the second book is called Petra Released. The third book, which I am working on and have a first draft sitting right over here, is called Petra Rising, and that will be out, whenever I finish it. Petra is a prison planet, so the fair amount of world building had to go into that. So happy to be here and happy to talk about it.
Stan?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Stan Latore, based out of Aurora, Colorado. So right in MileHiCon stomping grounds. Done a few series. There's Ansible, which is about 25th century Islamic telepaths who rocket up and down humanity's timeline and across space, trying to save our species from terrifying intergalactic predators. There's the Zombie Bible, just like it's billed in the title. It's biblical tales retold as episodes in humanity's enduring struggle against hunger and the hungry dead. And then my far future dystopia, the various Colosseums for Dinosaurs books. Think Hunger Games meets Jurassic Park meets Robinson Crusoe. And then I've written Write Worlds Your Readers Won't Forget, which is my toolkit for world building. And I've been extremely pleased with the acclaim that's gotten. And that's me.
Okay. Good. Steve?
Well, I'm Steve Wall. I am not a writer. I'm a reader. and I have a sizable library and have great interest when I come across a novel world building that's come into existence, like Hal Clement's Gravity World. I mean, wow, it's Flatland done real. So, I mean, I like seeing what happens when folks build something. I mean, there are I see just two ways of going. Either you can have the world itself be a character in your story, and so you spend a lot of time describing that character, or you can have something that is pretty much like what we have now, but have a novel setting in that environment. So I like what it goes into world construction, and I really like trying to figure out what's next.
Okay, John.
I'm John Barnes. I have 30-some published science fiction novels. The most recent was, 7 years ago now. Ages and ages ago, I did an essay called How to Build a Future that was intended to be sort of the social science or the temporal equivalent of Poul Anderson's classic How to Build a Planet. And I did tons of math for that. Over on the one other side of my life was always that I was a business statistician, and these days I'm a data scientist which is to say that I really produce fiction. Um, based on vast amounts of real data. And yeah, one of the things that I'm sort of a preacher of is that with not much more than first year high school algebra and a little bit of trust in spreadsheets and a willingness to look things up, most people can create much stranger worlds than we commonly see. It's kind of amazing how many people just say it was a jungle planet, it was raining on Mongo that morning, things like that. Instead of thinking, just a little doodling, and there's that miraculous moment when you're looking at the spreadsheet or when you're looking at the numbers in your graphs and you suddenly realize, oh, we are definitely not in Kansas anymore. And you have to figure out, but what does that look like when your boots are on the dirt there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I am probably the least accomplished author here, but
don't sell yourself short. I'm much less accomplished than you are.
Well, now wait a minute. But I am an author of sorts, and I do a fair amount of world building. Pretty much everything I write, of course, takes place in. I mean, it's science fiction, therefore there has to be world building. Right now, the piece that I'm working on, which I will be reading from on the Unlikely Heroes reading session, is a time travel story. Takes place in pretty much right where I live, but about 70 million years ago. So obviously there's a fair amount of building to do there. I'm also a scientist in bioinformatics, which means that the worlds that I build, like John said, you can, with a little math and a little data, you can build all kinds of worlds. And the worlds I build tend to be very small, but as an amateur paleontologist, I try to get something a little more macroscopic. So I guess the first question is, when you are setting out to build a world, and of course this depends an awful lot on what kind of world you're trying to build, but when you're setting out to build a world, what is your first step? Where do you start? I mean, you have an idea for a world, but an idea is not a setting any more than an idea is a plot. You have to flesh it out. So how do you go about that? Anyone who wants to answer that, please just go ahead and jump in.
Well, like John said, I doodle. I mean, and it may literally be drawing pictures on a piece of paper or just writing a scene that occurred to me. And then after that, I start to ask questions. And when I'm ready to get more systematic about it, I usually think about the world and I try to identify 3 things. If I'm doing like a sci-fi or a fantasy story, I want to find out, okay, what is strikingly different about the physical conditions for survival on this world? Secondly, is there a strikingly unforgettable creature on this world? It could be an army of roving undead, or it could be some alien life form that's completely unlike anything we've read before. But what is that unforgettable creature, and how do it and its environment interact? And then the third of the 3 things I try to find is, what is the unforgettable fact about whatever this culture is in the story, whether it's a like mafia family subculture or whether we're talking about an intergalactic civilization. At its core, what is this one thing that is strikingly different from the cultures that we know, and that has ripple effects throughout everything about how this culture interacts with its environment? And that one thing is going to be tightly related with the physical conditions for survival and the creature. So if, in Dune, the strikingly different fact is that you have a world with no precipitation, if you're just looking at Arrakis. And then you have the strikingly different creature, the sandworm, that helps to create that world. It's both an oxygen factory and the creator of the desert. And then you have this culture, the Fremen, who the strikingly different fact is the absolute necessity to conserve water, which then has ripple effects throughout the culture with how they care for their dead, what the rituals are, what's holy to them and not, and how they show respect, and all of that. And it creates all the opportunities for conflict in the story. So I try to find those 3 things, because I think if you have those 3 things, world building is deceptively simple. I think everything people new writers especially tend to treat it as this really, really complex thing. Like you've got to design these languages and you've got to make a Tolkien style project. But it's really just finding those three things: the physical conditions for survival, the unforgettable creature, and the unforgettable fact about the culture and how they interrelate to each other. And then it's really fun because you just play with that. You just figure out what are all the things that impacts, and all of a sudden you've got this incredible world that maybe didn't start in that initial doodle that different from ours, but suddenly looks a lot different from ours.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Chanel seems to be a big fan.
Thanks, Chanel.
Hi, Chanel. So for myself, I mean, I am not what one would call maybe a hard science fiction writer. My process is very unlikely to involve spreadsheets or things along those lines. But it's really hard for me to say that I have one particular way that I go about world building. I think it's going to vary from story to story with me. So, working with Petra, Petra is, as I said, a prison world. Okay. And so I've got this entire planet that's being used as a prison. Well, that's an awful waste of resources when you think about it, if that's the only thing you're using an entire planet for, right? So I got to thinking about, why would, a spacefaring civilization of some kind turn an entire planet into just use it as a prison? It seems like a huge waste of real estate. And so I had to ask myself that question. And that one question led me into the world building that I ended up using for Petra. What I posited then was a planet that had been colonized, and in the hopes of people reaping untold riches. Turns out this particular planet is resource poor. Okay, so I had to ask myself, all right, if it's resource poor, why is it resource poor? How does that happen? And I kicked around a couple of ideas. I asked some friends in a writers group, is it maybe a planet of a pop 2 star or something along those lines? And what I just kind of eventually ended up with is like, it's really not that much of a stretch of imagination to say that perhaps most of the valuable stuff might be locked too deep, too deep into the planet. And then I also just made it. Another thing that I did is I posited that this is a very old planet and it is tectonically dead. And that was kind of my main thing here. So if it's tectonically dead, you've got no volcanism. And then I had to think about, okay, well, what other kinds of consequences does that have? Kind of like what Stant was saying, what does that do? So, okay, if you have no tectonic activity, you're not going to have mountains getting any bigger. Okay, so maybe the planet was at one point tectonically active, it no longer is. So mountains are basically, they're not getting any taller and they will eventually erode. Okay, so you're not going to have super tall mountain ranges on this particular world. So those were the kinds of things that informed the world building of Petra, and all of that springing from the question, why would you waste that real estate? So the reason being, there's no resources to mine from this planet. It's pretty much a dead end, and so this is why they use it as basically this enormous human dumping ground. And that was kind of the whole genesis for the world building of Petra.
Sure, that's
It's fascinating because the other direction, that's fascinating because you've taken it as the prison is the dumping ground where you dump the undesirables. But the other direction you could have taken that too is it's a mining world and the prisoners are the slave labor. Because that's the other, those are kind of the two different models for prisons that we've seen a lot of human civilizations on Earth use.
I could have done that. I suppose I could have.
Well, I mean, you have all kinds of choices as to how you're going to build this world, and I mean, if that's you only need to pick one in this particular case, one explanation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we do have an open question, but John and Steve, I'd like to ask: do you have anything you'd like to say on the topic?
Yeah, well, one of the thought, this is just a follow-on thought too, is that, and this is one of those social science things. I think I first became aware of how important this sort of social science principle is from Poul Anderson, who was asked to contribute a story to Thieves World and at first declined, sending them a note saying, "Are you aware how many honest people it takes to support one thief?" I mean, it's like having an all predator planet, or an all predator ecosystem where all the predators are the size of lions or bigger, something like that. So one of those thoughts that occurs to me is that if you're going to have a prison planet, actually, or a prison, almost any kind of a prison colony, I mean, Australia or Siberia work just as well for this question. You have to be in a society that is planning to produce centuries of prisoners in quantity. And that is and I would bet that Matt had some procedure for doing that, because it's an obvious enough point. Those prisoners have to, now that, one of the ways that can happen, of course, is a straight up slave society. I mean, the primary offense of slave populations is generally not running fast enough when they really needed to, or having really bad luck where they got trapped. And that's one possibility, but there's political prisoners. There are religious cultures that can't execute people, but are perfectly happy with working them to death. There are societies that manufacture enormous numbers of crimes. We happen to live in one.
Funny you should mention that. That last one in particular plays a factor.
Yeah, it's there in Larry Niven's Jigsaw Man. If you remember that ghastly story where the hero is being held in prison and makes a temporary prison break as he tries to escape he knows the prison is temporary. He's going to be torn down for organs. And at the end, you learn he ran a red light. Because the society needs a lot of organs. And so...
Yeah.
The other option is that there's an interstellar war of some kind, and then what you're actually looking at is a long-term POW camp. Borders of Infinity by Lois McMaster Bujold is one of the best examples of that. But just that's an additional possibility.
Yeah.
I think there always has to be an economic bent to these sort of things, even with, say, a prison planet with very few resources. There's still got to be some economic feedback coming out of this thing. I mean, what's going to inspire them to build it there? There has to be some tie with it. I mean, like Dune, what Dune had was a substance that nobody else had and was absolutely essential. So they had a monopoly. They didn't have much in the way of resources, but it would have been just a shipwrecked Fremen story without that.
Yeah, and in particular too, that because you had to make that work, you needed the background of the Butlerian jihad. Thou shalt not make a machine in the image of the human mind, to explain why spice would be essential rather than just and that's sort of the rule that nothing has one consequence.
Right.
In my own series that begins with 1,000,000 open doors, it's civilization that by very slow colonization has gotten maybe 30 light years out from Earth. There's maybe 20 settled planets, and then suddenly discovers the transporter, instantaneous well, yeah, sure, it's used for getting from planet to planet, but it also means that in everybody's house after a while, there's the panel where you throw stuff straight to the dump. For waste disposal. And that as the hero ages, he notices more and more modern buildings don't have doors. And things like that.
Yeah, I mean,
I love that.
I guess what I like to what I like to do is ask myself the question, not just what will the reader believe, because of course that's your job when you're writing the story, is to make the reader believe it. What won't they believe? What will throw them out of the story? What will they say? this is just completely unbelievable. I cannot believe in this world, and then try to avoid that. Obviously, if you have a range of experiences where you know that certain things don't work. I mean, we talked about, for example, the economics of it and the ecology of the world, the implications of massive technological shifts. There is going to be someone in your audience who knows that subject intimately, and if you may not convince them 100% because they know more about it than you do, but what I always try to do is say, what would cause this person to throw the book across the room, or delete it from their Kindle or whatever, and then don't do that. Again, I'm writing a time travel story where it takes place primarily 69 million years ago in Colorado, and I have a lot of pro paleontologists on my Facebook friends list. And I'm hoping that at least some of them will want to read this. And, I don't expect them to agree with everything or to think that I get everything right, because I think that's probably impossible. But I'm hoping that none of them think that I got something too horribly wrong. And so thinking through the implications of the world you're creating and thinking, what is it that would really trip someone up? I think that's a really important step.
There's another way to look at that at the same time, within reason, though, which is when you have this idea and you're like, oh, well, that is so outlandish and unrealistic, it would throw someone completely out of the story. Again, within reason, you have to use your discernment as a storyteller, but for like the young writers listening in, the other way you can approach that is very playfully and say, okay, well, what is there that I haven't thought about yet in this world I'm building that renders that thing, that unrealistic, wild, outlandish thing, not only renders it both attractive and necessary, that makes it almost an inevitability within this world that I'm building. And then you play with it, and maybe you find it and maybe you don't. Maybe you, at the end of the day, you say, you know what, no, there's just no way to make that work.
Yeah.
Or maybe you find something extravagantly fascinating to play with.
I once wrote a novel, and it was an earlier piece of mine, probably truck material at this point, but it posited a future Earth wherein humankind had been genetically altered so that it no longer needed water, and that water had become an illegal drug, a controlled substance. That is a whopper of a premise. I knew that going in, and I did what I could to try to make it believable. Everybody I told about that story, they're like, "What?" Yeah. So I'm not quite sure if it ever came off, but they probably had other problems as well. But yeah, I totally get what you're talking about there.
Okay, so I'd like to address the question we've got. This comes from Kalen, and I think Stant. I think it probably goes back to what you started talking about, which is would a monster only be something like the sandworm? Oh, and now the question vanished.
No, it's in the answered tab now.
That's my fault. Just as you started talking, I hit send on an answer I was typing.
Okay.
So more people than me should get to answer it. So.
Okay, well, so the question is, would a monster only be something like the sandworm, or could it be other types of unique antagonists within the setting, such as storms or drought? Stant says, I'd class storms and drought as part of the physical conditions for survival, but as always, the answer is it depends. For example, a storm composed not of sand, but of sentient microscopic machines. I would actually argue that it doesn't have to be sentient to be a monster.
Agreed.
There's been some great stories written about survival in the face of harsh natural conditions. Some absolute classics. It's how, and certainly, this is something I never get tired of talking about. So I grew up in Colorado, and when I was in the service, I traveled all over the place, went through some very harsh environmental conditions, both heat, cold, wet, dry, etc. When they sent me to North Dakota, I experienced cold that I had never imagined before, including in the winter in the high Rockies. North Dakota, Northern Plains cold is like nothing else in the world.
Argo.
You don't you may not really believe that it wants to kill you personally, but
I mean, I don't know.
that wind, that 50 below ambient temperature, 90 below wind chill wind will get into doesn't matter how much you bundle up, it will get into every seam, every crevice of your clothing. It will try to bring you down. And I never understood the Wendigo legend before I lived in North Dakota. And so I would say that absolutely natural conditions can be monsters.
If I may throw in a outright plug for one of my more popular products, Mother of Storms by me. What I did with that was that in 1993 or 1992 and 3, NOAA, the folks formerly known as the Weather Bureau, actually released a little bitty would run on the desktop machines of the day version of their global weather models. And they've done, lots of people have done that since. It takes a little shopping around, but you can find lots of public domain models. And I just looked at it and said, okay, so they've put in all kinds of barriers here because they don't want people wandering off into complete fiction. But I had discovered there was the rapidly growing field of paleometeorology, which was they started to realize things like fossilized gravel banks tell you how much gravel could be carried, and you can find things where you've got fist-sized gravel, hundreds of yards deep, structured in a way that means that there must have been 350-mile-an-hour winds, and across not tornado radiuses of a few miles, but across hundreds of miles, things like that. So, Earth has been a rougher place at other times in its history. And eventually I hit on, and, it turned out I guessed right on some stuff, but it was just guesses. It turns out that, okay, hurricanes gain power when the surface temperature of the ocean they're passing over is greater than 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you could warm up the world fast, because if there's one thing science fiction editors do not like, it's gradual change. They don't want something they do not want something that happens across 150 years. They want it a Tuesday. They want the thing that could happen Tuesday.
Yeah.
So if you could warm up the ocean really fast, well, that's where I run across methane clathrates and the possibility of the now known as the clathrate gun and things like that. And all of a sudden I was saying, okay, if the whole ocean surface almost up to the poles was at that temperature, the curving path of hurricanes would in fact turn into a circle, and you'd have hurricanes that just kept gaining energy. Basically, pushing tsunami-sized things in front of them with tornado-force winds. And it was fun. I think in my fictional version of things, about 5 billion people died, and man, just can't beat that for reader enjoyment.
Well done.
Definitely. I think too, on the question of storms and monsters, I mean, if you come up with an incredible thing about the physical conditions for survival that is catastrophic and monstrous, and then you want to make the world just a little more complex and create more opportunities for plot and exert more pressures on the characters, then think, okay, and then what unforgettable creature would be either a response or partly responsible for creating those conditions. And you just, with a few quick brushstrokes, you can make your world much fuller. Very classic old school example, Pern. Right. In Pern, the storm is that every 200 years or sometimes 400 years, you have killer fungus falling from the sky, basically. And so then there's and it could just be that, right? The whole story could just be there's killer fungus, both unforgettable creature and unforgettable physical condition for survival falling from the sky. But then you throw in dragons too, because that's how this world is going to respond to killer fungus falling from the sky. So often when you come up with this crazy thing about the pressures on survival in this world, then you can say, okay, so what you can come up with organisms that are related to that, or other things that are related to that, and a few quick brushstrokes, and all of a sudden you've got the framework for a really interesting world.
Sure. Or conversely, throw in throw in completely unrelated things. The other thing that I threw into Mother of Storms was cheap, effective, direct person to brain to brain transfers of experience,
Hmm.
which among other things means that one of the things that the governments of Earth are worrying about as these giant hurricanes start to form is that they have the recent experience known as Global Riot 1, which is
Oh, fascinating.
basically, I mean, the let's go out and loot impulse was transmittable brain to brain across the whole planet. So,
Love it.
yeah, things like that.
Nightmare scenario. Love it.
Yeah, but it also means that basically the whole planet can think about what are we going to do about these hurricanes together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. So, switching gears a little bit, let's talk about some of the mechanics of world building. And by mechanics, I mean, how do you keep your own world straight? One of the moderator questions is, do you draw maps? And that is a really valid question. Because of course, I think Stan, with you mentioned that you don't have to start out with this Tolkien-like building this enormous history and backstory and set of languages for your world and geography for your world, but of course a lot of authors do. It's almost become a cliche in fantasy now to start with the map. And of course, some great fictional worlds, famous fictional worlds, have been created without maps. And then a bunch of people came in, and Howard's Hyborian Age, Darkover, Pern. None of these started out as very carefully planned worlds. It was just things. The authors just kind of put things wherever they wanted them to be, and then other people came along later and drew the maps. But so do you draw maps? Do you build a historical timeline? If you do have invented languages, do you have a glossary? How much of that do you try to do?
Yeah, as little as possible for myself. I just want to be able to get to start the story. And I'm pretty lazy just by nature. So I don't. I have on occasion drawn maps. I do kind of love stories with maps in them. I grew up on Dune, and I grew up on Tolkien. So and I would study those maps. I would just study them. But and the maps that I draw, I mean, I've played some D&D. I've done some DMing. So I've drawn some maps out that were, pretty, fairly, detailed and accurate and all that. I don't like having to do that. I'd rather not. So generally, like when I wrote Petra, I had a very general kind of map that I just sort of sketched out. It wasn't super duper complicated. I had this kind of subtropical island, which is kind of where everything is controlled from, and it was called Control. And the great thing about that island is since it's surrounded by ocean, it's really hard to assault. Like any of the prisoners who decide they want to assault it are going to have a hell of a time doing so. And then I posited a couple of super huge land masses. One was called Mainland, imaginatively enough. Another one was called Southland. Guess where that is? The other one was called Farside. Okay, but I did that simply because that's how I think a lot of people name things. I mean, you look at Australia, the sandy desert. Look at America. We've got the Rocky Mountains. How imaginative is that name?
We shall call it this land.
Yeah.
Well, and America, a lot of it's covered up because we're settled by people who spoke several different languages. Detroit, the Straits.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess the two answers to this question of do you do a map or a glossary or really anything else, I think there's two questions I'd ask. One is it useful to you as a storyteller? If yes, do it. Two, do you think it's going to be entertaining to your reader or to you? If yes, do it. If it doesn't entertain you and it's not useful to you in conceptually mapping out your world, then don't. But if it is, do. But to throw out a kind of adjacent idea, if you do work with maps, there's a lot of really fascinating things you can do besides just a 21st century American style depiction of your world, because maps are also a story. They're a story that the people tell their culture about the world, about its boundaries, about what's important, what's central. If you look at maps of the world that are created in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, they're maps that have Jerusalem, the holy city, marked in the center, and the rest of the map radiates out from it. If you look at standard flat maps of the globe that you might see like tacked up on a schoolroom wall, or you would if we weren't in the world of Zoom and during the pandemic. But if you looked at those in our culture, you'll see like a United States or a North America that's larger or as large as Africa. That's just like the proportions are grossly inaccurate, and certain parts of the world are emphasized while certain parts of the world are de-emphasized. And it's because there's a story being told about the world that's implicit in that map. We have the convention in our maps that north is up, but what if that's not true in the maps in your world? How your map can be a clue to how the culture you're writing organizes its society and understands its world. And if you approach it that way, it could be really entertaining and really fun to come up with a kind of map that's completely different than anything that we've seen, and is completely different because of how that world works.
Incidentally, there's a episode of The West Wing, if anyone's a West Wing fan, that deals with exactly that issue, Stan.
Yeah. And of course, part of that is just it's a geographical accident. The northern hemisphere land masses in the northern hemisphere look larger. On the other hand, it's a good question as to whether or not that ever would have become accepted as the standard European and American projection if it had made Europe and North America look smaller. So that's an open question.
Well, one of the things, I mean, the infamous Mercator projection, I mean, started for the most practical of all reasons, which was with the Mercator projection, you could use a straight edge to lay out, essentially it converted all the great circle routes to straight lines. You could, if you laid a straight edge between 2 points on there, you would get the compass bearing that was your shortest distance to where you were trying to go. And those things were developed as sailing maps originally. And then they were, because they were everywhere, because it was a seafaring civilization, they ended up on schoolroom walls. And the result is that we all know that Greenland is much, much more important than South America. But it was a navigation tool. Well, other cultures and other civilizations have navigated in other ways and have traveled in different ways. It happened, because we're the culture that came up with the machine gun first, we got to decide that ours was the most sophisticated way. But you could easily picture a map that instead of following the straight lines of latitude and longitude, followed ocean currents, like the Polynesians.
Yeah.
Or prevailing winds, before the lateen sail in the late Middle Ages, basically ships had to run in front of the wind. So you could easily picture something that looked more like a metro transport map that just said, run down this wind, and these are the cities you come to in this order, this far apart, or this long apart, rather than, in other words, time rather than distance for them.
Yeah.
Real different picture of the world.
Completely different, because it's built around what's functional for that people. Say you're writing a fantasy novel and you go even more outlandish than this. What if you have a people that only travel not in their waking lives in space, but only through their dreams?
And then they'd have completely different geography. Steve, do you have a preference as a reader? I mean, do you like opening up a book and seeing a map or a glossary or a historical timeline, or do you care?
I do. I mean, I will refer to it as the story goes on, and then I would, one example was like Game of Thrones. Basically you have a world that is England, except for it's got this big ice wall to the north, and then it's kind of got some tropical areas where it makes sense for plot purposes, but it's pretty much Northern Europe. And but it was interesting to see, because it was not, I don't think Game of Thrones was a big exercise in world building, with the exception of that winter could take a generation.
Mhm.
He never described why that is, but interesting. I thought that I'm trying to think of what would make that happen. Is it a three-body problem with the sun? Is it a giant? Are they circling a giant planet?
Mhm.
They never just describe what's going on there. It's just that winter's coming and it's going to be a lot.
George Martin has actually said in interviews, so he's like, come on, guys, it's magic. he's had people do exactly what you're talking about, Steve, trying to figure out how it would work scientifically. And he's like, folks, it's just
I
magic.
know. So sometimes it's just nice to go back to the math and go.
It is.
We are getting fairly short on time, and we do have a couple of unanswered questions that I'd like to go ahead and get to real quick.
Sure.
So from Jess Weaver, we have the question, should the world building form the story or the story form the world building, or is either approach equally valid? I would say absolutely either one is valid. It really depends on what you want to emphasize, and of course, what do you prefer as a reader. But I've certainly read stories that I enjoyed tremendously, where there really wasn't much of a plot, but the world was so intricate that it held my attention. I've read stories with very sketchy world building, with lots going on, and that held my attention. So either one, I think, is fine, or anywhere in between, as long as it's done well.
I think either one, as long as the two aren't separate. And it doesn't matter to me which one you start with. The main thing in my mind, and I think this is where people start talking about world builders disease among fantasy writers, especially where you've got like a Bible of your world and multiple notebooks stacked on top of each other, but you haven't started the story. I think as long as you don't see them as separate, like world building, the world you create isn't this academic exercise separate from your story. However much fun it is, it's something that creates opportunities for the plot, and it exerts pressure on your characters. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, really, what we're talking about here is setting as character.
Yes.
And the the setting is distinctive enough, it's going to become a character in the story. I have another story that I wrote, which is set on another alien planet, and basically the main part about it was this mountain. It's a mountain climbing story, and what I basically did is I have this mountain that's basically Mount Everest topped with this impossible to climb spire of rock that's called the steeple. Actually, this comes right out of my home state of Nebraska. If you're familiar with Nebraska, there's a formation out west called Chimney Rock. It was a landmark on the Oregon Trail. Basically, I took Mount Everest and I put Chimney Rock on top of it, but that mountain became a character in the story, really.
It really is a both at the same time kind of problem. A huge influence on my creative process was that in some of my past incarnations, I taught theater scene design. I was a scene designer for a while. And best teacher I had, Bill Rowell, used to teach us to, because you're solving a problem here. You have a space in which people are going to interact. It's the same problem. In the case of scene design, you've got this problem that it simultaneously has to, represent the vasty fields of France on, what's basically a few bare boards. The way you solve that problem in modern scene design a lot of the time is that first you draw the environment that you're trying to really represent. You're doing Death of a Salesman. You draw Willy Loman's house. You draw what the house would actually look like. And then you start cutting through it with, rotating a plane, looking and saying, okay, what's the best way to look at this? Oh man, the kitchen door needs to move to the other side. And then you start saying, okay, and what do people see through the windows and doors? Those are known in the trade as reveals. And eventually you end up with something where you've taken the pieces of this huge imagined world, but they only go as far as the audience can see through the window. You've cut that imagined world down to the point where 3 inches after the audience can see, there's nothing. Actually, there's a couple of actors making out. That's usually what's there.
Steve, did you have anything you wanted to add to that, or?
Me,
Yeah.
uh, no, I don't.
Okay. All right. So we have one more question that I would like to try to get to real quick. I think we've got a couple minutes. So from Jim Henderson, if you draw maps, do you use any particular tools for that, and how you deal with putting them in books, formatting, etc.? That might, some of that, the second part of that question actually might be a little bit out of the scope of this panel, I think. And if anybody has anything to contribute on that, please do, because it's more of a technical question. The first part is I'm going to say for myself, I can't draw in Photoshop. I'm not going to say I'm a great artist on paper either, but I can at least sketch a map. And so if I ever do such a thing, it's always going to be hand drawn and then photographed or scanned in. But I am kind of interested to know, are there any world building tools? I guess that's a bigger question, which is, is there any software, or are there any physical tools out there that are useful for anything that we've discussed here?
Let me recommend Steve Gillette's book on, it's the basic equations. If you do want to set up a planet with, orbits that are consistent with gravity as we know it, and things like that, and stars that aren't so big that they become black holes, and so then Steve Gillette's book, Worldbuilding, Writer's Digest Press, very nice compendium of most of the relevant equations. And just look online, because there are some misprints in it, and hundreds of people have delighted themselves by printing the fact that there are misprints in the book.
I've definitely seen some. I haven't used it. I've definitely seen some software for creating fantasy maps. It looks to me like it doesn't take any sensible climatological or planetological principles or ecological principles into account, and it's kind of just aesthetically create a map that looks a lot like the Middle Earth map but isn't Middle Earth. That's out there if someone wants to use it. I don't personally find that attractive. On the rare occasions that I've done a map, I've first drawn a copy of it myself, because I want to think very much about what's going on with that climate, right? If you got mountains, there's a rain shadow on one side and there's wet country on the other side, and just thinking about that, because that impacts culture and all of that. And then I send it to a designer. I send it to somebody who knows their shit and can make it pretty, because my chicken scratch might be charming, but the thing I'd want to put into a book, or I send it to my publisher if it was a traditionally published novel, and they have a designer work on it to take my chicken scratch and make a visually prettier version of it.
Edwin Dewey founded the Center for the Study of Cycles, which was, frankly, intellectually, it was a nut group. I mean, his fascination was with anything that exhibited cyclical behavior, but the result is that there still is a Center for the Study of Cycles. They have an enormous library of things that appear to run cyclically. It's a nice way to put history forward. That's, I mean, you can look and say, okay, at fairly predictable intervals, there are fairly predictable changes in fashion, in music, and so forth. And kind of run it forward and say, okay, we are due in like another 10, 12 years for a whole lot more A-shaped skirts. After generations of mostly things that clung to the legs, there's going to be a lot of stuff flaring out. That's a fairly, and of course you don't really care. It's just that, but if you're writing a character who is going to be 20 around then, that is what they will think is attractive. That's what, and that's what they'll think looks modern, where, old ladies wear, or old men, depending on where your culture went, wear pencil skirts, things like that.
I would think that the map is the last thing done. I think what you do is you come up with settings for your scenes, and you might have relative positions of them to other settings. And so you could draw that. I mean, I could draw that. I could just draw a line, this is, pretty far. But then once the thing is done, you say, okay, I've got these relationships of these different settings. Let's let's show that in an interesting way.
I think that's generally true. I also think there are really no hard and fast rules about that. Sometimes moving things around on the map, or again, historical timelines is another one. If you know the book, The Timetables of History, which is a wonderful book, I highly recommend it. It helps you see how these various historical events fit together, and doing something similar in your created world very often helps create that setting and make that setting much better. So I think it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. I don't think there's a hard and fast rule about where you start with that.
I'm afraid I would get so involved in the cartography and.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely a risk. I mean, remember Tolkien created his corpus of languages for, I think, a decade or more before he ever writing a single word of the fictional story. So
Yeah, but there is that other way, and there have been some. There's not many. It's not the common way to do it, but some people have. And in fact, I did with my Daybreak series. Write the history first. You know, write the whole future history out, and then say, all right, I'm going to pick interesting people to live in this world, and write it more or less as if it were a mainstream novel set in that world.
Yeah.
And you can do that. I would warn you that it'll take up a great big chunk of your life, and they won't give that back to you later.
It all comes down to what's useful to you and what's entertaining to you. Again, we've been talking about maps and timelines as a history of the world thing, or a map of a world, or a map of a galactic civilization thing, but it could also be a map of a battle, or it could be the timeline of a single day starting, and maybe it's not even a linear timeline. Maybe it's a mind map that starts with the pivotal event on that day and then links it up to all the things it's linked in. I mean, do whatever's entertaining to you and useful to you and the reader in unpacking this world, or in setting
if you're not having fun, the reader won't either.
Yeah,
For sure.
That's true.
For sure. Another reason why I don't spend a whole lot of time doing that.
Right. And if it's not fun for you, then don't do it. Yeah.
You can also have a map or a timeline that's a lie.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't need to be a glossary for your story. It could be the propaganda machine for some system or government or person in your story, and it could be a lie as well.
That was one of the when the episode 7 of Star Wars was coming. I don't remember titles of them, but the starting the finishing trilogy. In the preview, I thought, oh man, finally they might do something cool in Star Wars, instead of basically just filming everything that we'd all been reading about for all these decades. They didn't. But the thing that Han Solo was encountering young people who thought that the whole thing was a legend.
Mm-hmm.
Sat there and thought, wow, okay, so with all those Jedi mind and Sith mind control powers, what if the Emperor has in effect engineered it so that people think the last great rebellion was 1,000 years ago, when in fact there are people walking around who were part of it? That would have been much more interesting than what happened,
For sure.
Okay. So I think we are getting very close to time here.
Mhm.
I think this has been a good discussion. Obviously, we could go on forever. But does anybody have any kind of closing thoughts, summations, anything they'd like to say?
Well, I like what Stan had to say is, do what's fun for you, and what makes your story interesting to you and to your reader. There's a million different ways to do it. There's not one way you can do it. Hard science, you can have spreadsheets and charts and tables and all that. You can do it the way I do. You could just throw things against the wall and see what sticks. There's a lot of different ways to do it, but do what works for you and makes what's best for the story.
Yeah.
Sadly, there's a kind of a trade-off, and I know of no way that we ever escape from it, is that a lot of times some really bad world building is really psychologically satisfying. I mean, the way we would like the world to be is absolutely implausible, and if your reader wants to read about the way they'd like the world to be, then you probably don't need to plot all those orbits.
There you go.
I think, you know, the big goal, and maybe this is a good place to finish up. I think a really good goal is to make a world that is a place your readers would want to live, where you would like to live, but that they can also believe in. And I agree that there is a trade-off to some degree, but, you know, a lot of authors have done that with great fictional worlds. And I think it's possible, and I think that should really be kind of where your world building is heading. At least, maybe not live there, but at least visit.
I think the key too is to indulge your curiosity. That this is really about play. World building is recapture. If you're not doing it in a deadly doldrum way, there can be a million techniques for it, but it's ultimately about recapturing what you did when you were 8.
Yes.
And you're just asking questions. You're asking why, over and over again. And in my current book, one of the various organisms on this planet is very bear-like, but it's phosphorescent. It's basically this giant alien cave bear. And one of the things about it is it has biological symbiotes living in its hair that make it glow in the dark. So I had to think. So I just started to ask questions. Well, hang on. There aren't a lot of phosphorescent predators outside of the deep ocean. How is this not a problem in catching food? Like, why does this not bother the bear in hunting?
I'm afraid that's time. And so we're going to have to go ahead and end it there. But thank you all very, very much. And sorry about that. That was my phone. And okay, great discussion. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. Have a great con.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. See you at the next.
Bye, guys.